Continuing now on Newsmax Prime by looking back in history. On this day in history, looking back 285 years, as on November 14th, 1732, the Library Company of Philadelphia signed a contract with its first librarian. Founded by Benjamin Franklin and Friends in November of 1731, the library enrolled members for a fee of 40 shillings, but had to wait for books to arrive from England before beginning full operation. We are a nation of bibliophiles, that is to say, book lovers, and our passion for reading has not diminished as we turn from history to the here and now. We know the Middle East has always been an area of great strategic importance to the United States. But during the days of Dwight David Eisenhower and Ike's administration, a very interesting episode that we need to talk about. In fact, it is covered in a brand new book. The book's title, Ike's Gamble, America's Rise to Dominance in the Middle East. And we are pleased to be joined by the book's author, Michael Doran, who comes to us tonight from Newsmax, Washington. Quite a resume Michael enjoys. Former Senior Director of the National Security Council, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, and a former Senior Advisor in the State Department. Today, he's a Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. Michael, we really appreciate your time here on Newsmax Prime. And before we go back to talk about America's relationship among nations, and especially there in the Middle East, let's talk about the here and now and the transition from President Obama to President Trump in January. It has been a curious 8 years under Mr. Obama, kind of a rocky road with Israel. Back during the campaign, Donald Trump met with Benjamin Netanyahu, and the Israeli Prime Minister came away optimistic following that meeting. Let's look and listen.
You are a great friend of Israel. Over the years, you've expressed your support consistently, and I deeply appreciate it. I look forward to working with you to advance security, prosperity, and peace. Israel is grateful for the broad support it enjoys among the American people, and I'm confident that the two of us, working closely together, will bring the great alliance between our two countries to even greater heights.
Actually, we see there a specific video message that the Prime Minister offered after Mr. Trump's election. So, how do you view President-elect Trump and the Middle East, especially our relationship with Israel?
Well, good evening, and thanks for having me. I think the relationship with Israel is set for improvement. I think that would have been true whether it was Hillary Clinton who had been elected or under President Trump. There's no doubt about that. There's just no reason at this stage for all the tension that we've had in the relationship under President Obama, because the Arab world is going through an unprecedented period of disruption. Israel is an island of stability in this very unstable region, and so we ought to be having very good relations. And I think that that's sort of the natural setting in these circumstances.
Michael, I hesitate to ask you to pull out the crystal ball, but there is some concern that here at the 11th hour, President Obama will do a full-blown diplomatic recognition situation of Palestine's Liberation Organization or the Palestinian people. Do you anticipate anything like that?
I had assumed until Donald Trump was elected, I had assumed that something of that nature was in the offing. Now that we have Donald Trump, they're basically threatening to undo President Obama's legacy across the board. I think it's going to be a lot harder for President Obama to do anything that will have lasting significance, because it will be extremely controversial, and Donald Trump will fight it at every stage, and he'll be telling President Obama and the world that whatever he does is not going to stand. So I suspect that President Obama might back away from those intentions if he indeed had them.
Now, Michael, to your book, Understanding What Is Past is Prologue, there have been other books about Eisenhower, his days in the White House, that I guess fall into the revisionist category. You are digging deeply into the whole episode involving the Suez Canal, and the history books who say Ike was not especially fond of Israel, but was intrigued by Egypt being the powerful nation with, of course, Gamal Abdel Nasser in charge back then. Take us through the popular perception and what you found in writing Ike's Gamble.
Well, it's definitely true that that Eisenhower was very interested when he came into power in distancing the United States from Israel, and also from Britain, its other great ally in the region. There's no doubt about that. In fact, Eisenhower and Secretary of State Dulles, they discussed it openly before the American public. The view was that Britain was in decline. Britain, which was the dominant power at the time. Winston Churchill, it was his last government. Winston Churchill was seeking to revitalize the British Empire. The Americans believed that the best days of the empire were behind us. Nationalism was rising. Nasser in Egypt was seen as the wave of the future. And the United States wanted to get on good terms with Nasser and therefore with the entire Arab world. And it thought the only way to do that was by distancing the U.S. from Israel and Britain. And Eisenhower pursued that policy with great vigor for about 6 years.
And as we look back at Ike, because later in 1958, of course, the Marines were sent into Lebanon, what is our overall lesson about Dwight Eisenhower, his brinksmanship in foreign policy, and how it affects the here and now?
Well, I think Eisenhower was an exceptionally gifted president when it came to foreign policy, and I think that he eventually came to regard that initial policy of distancing the United States from Britain and Israel as a mistake, but it was a very costly one. It came to climax in the Suez Crisis when Britain, France, and Israel simultaneously attacked Egypt, and Eisenhower took the side of the Egyptians. Together with the Soviet Union. He worked in parallel with the Soviet Union, took the side of the Egyptians, and stopped the British, French, and Israelis in their tracks. And he hoped that by doing this, he would create a space for cooperation between Egypt and Arab nationalism in the United States. Instead, he created a space for cooperation between Egypt and the Soviet Union. The Soviets moved into the breach. And the Suez Crisis was followed by a wave of revolution, not unlike the revolutions we had in 2011. And all of those revolutions worked to the advantage of Egypt and the Soviet Union and to the disadvantage of the United States. It culminated in 1958 in a revolution in Iraq, which wiped out the most Western-leaning country in the Arab world. And that's the stage at which Eisenhower sent troops into Lebanon, and at the same time facilitated British troops into Jordan to shore up the last remaining regimes that were pro-Western at the time. Eisenhower, as he's sending troops into Lebanon, he looked back at the policy that he had followed for the previous 6 years, and he realized that instead of stabilizing the Middle East and creating a basis for cooperation with Arab nationalism, he had actually destabilized it.
Eisenhower, for many, is far from the caricature that the history books give us, and to some he remains an enigma we try to solve, or you try to solve, in your new book, Ike's Gamble, America's Rise to Dominance in the Middle East. Michael Doran, we thank you for your time tonight here on Newsmax Prime.
Thank you. Much appreciated.